I would now like to invite Dr. Parag Khanna, Senior Research Fellow from the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Kuan School of Public Policy, for a speech on why connectivity is destiny. Dr. Khanna, please.
It bothers me immensely that you have never seen this map, because this is a map of everything that we have built as human civilization, particularly over the last 100 years. This is every highway, every railway, every oil and gas pipeline, electricity grid, and internet cable on the planet Earth is on this map. But in no classroom here in the Lee Kuan Yew School, in no office building in Singapore, or anywhere else in the world will you see a map that shows you what we as mankind have built. But in fact, if you map infrastructure, if you map connectivity, the things that we have built to connect our societies, particularly our cities, to each other, what you get, especially in a time-lapse view, is an image of a human civilization that is stretching its tentacles and its reach all over the planet, installing an exoskeleton, bolting it onto the planet. That is called topographical engineering. And it is a whole new way of thinking about how we organize ourselves as a human species. And these are I liken it to the systems of a human body, a skeletal system, a vascular system, and a nervous system that together form the networks of this global civilization. So you don't see these maps anywhere because we're accustomed to finding two kinds of maps that shape how we think. And remember that maps are considered mankind's oldest propaganda tool, the oldest infographics in the world. They have forever shaped how we view not only how the world is organized, but even power dynamics in the world today. So they are extremely fundamental to how we frame the world. We're accustomed to maps of natural geography. Blue for the oceans, brown for the deserts, green for the forests. So far, so good. We're mostly used to the second kind of maps, political geography, that show national boundaries, legal sovereignty, how we divide ourselves from each other. What's been missing all this time is maps of functional geography, which is, again, all of the infrastructure, all of the things that we have ourselves built. Now, it may surprise you to know that the volume of all of those highways and railways and pipelines and electricity grids and internet cables is more than 100 times longer than all of the borders in the world put end to end to end. And yet we don't bother to show ourselves, we don't bother to teach our children that this is in fact how the world is truly organized. And to properly understand the complexity of the world today, we need to understand this layering of the natural geography, the political geography, and the functional geography. And then we may arrive at entirely new conclusions about the foundational principles of our human organization. We might question, for starters, one of the oldest adages in all of the social sciences, the notion that geography is destiny. Such a grave statement that I've been hearing probably since the 4th grade. But is it really true? Is a landlocked country condemned to be poor? Not necessarily. Are countries at tropical latitudes destined to be underdeveloped? Well, I think we're living in one that is not so underdeveloped from what I can see. And we'll start to rethink the arc of history. Are we destined to forever live in the confines of sovereign nation states? Is that in fact the immutable permanent unit that defines who we are as individuals or as collectives? Maybe not. So is division really the one overriding principle? Is that the natural order of things? In fact, we're just beginning a phase in which we will see that connectivity will vastly supersede division as the most powerful force. Let me take exactly a 30-second tour of the last 1,000 years, the 5 stages of globalization. In fact, what's happening today has its origins centuries ago, at least since what we think of as the Silk Road era, the time at which merchants from Europe and the Middle East crossed Eurasia, reaching China, and establishing transcontinental trading networks. Power dynamics of colonialism and imperialism driven by Europe also advanced globalization and connectivity. Think about the infrastructures built by the British Empire, or even by the Russian empires that expanded eastward and southward, across, whether it's the British in Africa or South Asia and so forth. Infrastructure has been a tool of imperial expansion, but it has also advanced the cause of connectivity. And when empires retreat, the infrastructure is still there, allowing new countries and societies to take advantage of it. And then, of course, technology. We have trade, we have geopolitics, we have technology that advances connectivity. We've moved from the age of the steamship, from the age of ships to railways, to jet aircraft, and modern industrial technologies that are further accelerating connectivity. And then, of course, institutions. Particularly in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, the rise of a global multilateral trading system, global foreign investment, the dispersal of global supply chains, China becoming the world's factory floor, all of that is possible or became possible as a result of the physical connectivity of all geographies in the world, which is just setting the stage for today. Total globalization, this new phase. And it's so funny when I hear people say that this is the end of globalization. In the literature that I read, or all of you, if you read The Economist, you can't go a week without picking up the FT or the Economist or some newspaper saying, it's the end of globalization, because there's been a 2% deceleration in global trade growth over the last 6 quarters, or something like that. Well, that's not really the big picture, is it? You want to reframe the world, look at the fact that we are just beginning to deploy the information communications technologies that allow any two people on the planet Earth to connect to each other. And we have barely even begun to harness that force. So I submit to you that globalization is alive and well, and the more we invest in connectivity, the more globalization we will have. This being a public policy school with a global policy bent, let me just stop and make a comment that's both systemic and historical, but also political, and about the policies and the changes of just the last quarter century. And this is especially relevant exactly today because the Soviet Union collapsed between the course of August and December of the year 1991. Many of us in this room remember that, and we should see a lot more in the news, retrospectives about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what we call that period, the last quarter century, is a Goldilocks era. No major conflict among great powers, liberalization of economies. Every country in the world has become capitalist. We have trading networks, we have financial networks, we have the movement of peoples, all in a world of relative geopolitical stability. And of course, the other thing that happened at that time, 25 to 27 years ago, was the birth of the internet. The same year that the Berlin Wall fell, the World Wide Web was born. In 25 years, all of these forces have combined to bring us to this phase where connectivity is accelerating at a breathtaking pace. So much so that one could say that the Westphalian era, as much as it still exists, we still have nations, states, and boundaries and international law. Of course we do. But the maps that I was showing you earlier talk about the layers. We still have natural geography, we still have political geography, but now we have a new layer of functional geography. And so some people say it's not only a Westphalian world anymore, it's also a supply chain world, where the supply of anything can meet the demand for anything, anywhere in the world. And that is a consequence of connectivity. And as I said, we have only just begun. Today, as we stand here, we spend already 2.5 times as much on infrastructure around the world as we do on defense. All the militaries in the world put together spend less than half of what they actually spend on building the world, on building cities, on building transportation, on building electricity grids. But we don't talk about that as much. It's by far the largest component of public expenditure, not defense. And by some estimates, we will spend more in the next 40 years than we have, or build as much in the next 40 years as we have in the last 4,000 years. And I believe this is actually a moral obligation. A year and a half ago, when the United Nations ratified the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they included something new, infrastructure. They said that it enables all of the other goals. It is a platform on which human development occurs. And it is reshaping every single continent of the world. Europe is a familiar story. to many of us. We know that since the creation of the European coal and steel community, which eventually evolved into the European Union, there has been such a functional integration of European energy grids, for example. It has become an authority in its own right. The utilities and the shared utilities of energy, of finance, and so forth have superseded much of the political national sovereignty within Europe. Of course, there's some backlash against that, but this is already baked into the system. Let me give you an example. When the Fukushima nuclear incident happened some years ago, the German government pledged to cut its usage, to shut down all of its nuclear reactors and so to speak, to go green or non-nuclear. But has it? Absolutely not. Where does Germany get a lot of its electricity from today? French nuclear power. Germany can't go non-nuclear even if it wanted to. That's just one tiny example of the thorough integration of European functionality, even though their sovereignty hasn't necessarily changed. And of course, let's bring it right home to this region. This is a region that many think of as second only to Europe, although perhaps way behind, maybe even decades behind, and not even headed in the same direction of supranational integration. But functional integration is taking this region into directions that the rest of the post-colonial world is not anywhere near reaching. And it is also the story of why this region has such immense promise. We're all excited for Kishore's book on this subject coming out soon, because no individual ASEAN country can compete industrially or economically or measure up to China or to India. But here, the 700 million people who live in our corner of the world have a larger GDP than India with less than half the population, are receiving more foreign investment than China with, of course, less than half the population. And that is the result of functional integration of infrastructure, liberalization and opening of markets, sharing supply chains and productive assets. And that's how economies grow from billions, or individual economies measured only in billions, to a region that is indeed now measured in trillions, and is certainly the bright spot, if you will, of growth in amongst emerging markets. And let's zoom in a little bit closer, right here to our very own neighborhood. The Sijori growth triangle, right? The Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia growth triangle, an idea that has been in development for decades, and in fact already has brought great benefits to the Riau Islands and now to Johor. What is economics actually about? The optimization, the factor inputs of production: land, labor, and capital. Singapore has capital, but not a lot of land. Malaysia and Indonesia have more land and more people, but less capital. And what's been happening for several decades now is that these three countries, despite the bitter legacies of post-colonial antagonisms and rivalries, have said, with each passing generation, let's actually functionally integrate more and more. Let's build more transportation corridors. Let's not just have one bridge or two, let's have a high-speed rail. Right? Let's cooperate on commercial real estate. Let's cooperate on the shipbuilding industry. Let's cooperate on electronics manufacturing. And gradually you achieve a functional integration despite the fact, or because of the fact, that your political sovereignty is no longer disputed or contested, but it's settled and accepted. And that is the evolution that is happening not only here, but in many other parts of the world, which I'm going to show you. But it's driven by cities. It's driven by connections among cities. And perhaps the most important thing in reframing the world is looking at the way in which, instead of maps that ignore human beings, we start to map where we are. And we appreciate that the dynamics of people and the viewpoints of people who live in cities can be quite different from those who don't. And what this map shows you is every single human being on the planet Earth. Here we are, with yellow being the most dense geographies. And what you see is that we are not naturally inclined towards dividing ourselves into bordered, politically bordered states. We are a coastal, urban civilization. If an alien came from outer space and observed us without us knowing and then flew back to his galaxy and wrote up his report, he wouldn't say, mankind is divided into 200 sovereign states. He would say, these 8 billion people like to concentrate themselves in cities and coastal areas. That is what we are. That is what we do. Countries, empires come and go, rise and fall. Our demographic concentration into cities is something that is actually the story, the real arc of history that goes back about 60,000 years. And so you can identify no matter how many countries we have in the world, we had only 50 countries in the world when the United Nations was founded. We have 200 today. But what matters just as much, if not more, is that we are organizing ourselves ever more into these magnetic megacity clusters around which smaller urban areas and rural areas organize themselves, because these are our economic magnets and nodes. And what these cities want to do more than anything else is not divide themselves from each other, but to physically connect to each other. And it is these 50 cities, these magnetic cities, these radiant centers of economic and demographic activity that are driving all of this infrastructure investment in the world today. Now, as I said, it's happening everywhere, so I'll show you just a few more images as before I wind down. But in Africa, the more you have the codification of sovereignty, Africa has more countries than any other continent, right? More than 50 countries in Africa. And maybe it will have, I'm showing you all the secessionist movements, all the active secessionist movements in Africa. There could be 10 or 15 more countries. And despite the divisions and the devolution, you also have more aggregation. You have plans for electricity grids, railway grids, trade networks, and even as of last month when the African Union got together, one African shared passport, one African free trade area. That's the goal by 2020. So don't just look at the political map that shows us splintering apart. That's part of why we have to come together. Small countries, and we know this very well here, can't survive on their own. Small countries have no choice but to connect. So the more countries we have, the more devolution we have, the more we're going to build more infrastructure to connect to each other because we need each other. Even the Middle East, the region that, not to sugarcoat it, the one that we think is the most hopeless. It is an ancient geography, an ancient region, where the cities, whether it is, for example, Beirut, or whether it is Alexandria or Cairo, predate the caliphates and the modern states by thousands of years. The cities will always be there. It's the countries that will come and go. And what the cities want is to build these trade networks, to build these energy networks, to exchange and trade and undertake commerce with each other. And that is, in a way, because the Arab world is already so completely urbanized. Do you want to live in the desert? Or do you want to live in the city? Right? Most Arabs already live in cities. They want this. And the next map of the Arab world is not going to have as strong states. It's going to have more infrastructural connections. And let me wind down just with this. It is, of course, our region, Asia. Most of the entire world's population, here we don't need a spherical globe, most of the entire world's population lives right here on this slide. And for all of our lifetimes, that is going to be true. And what is happening now with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, with the One Belt, One Road, and the new Silk Roads that will stretch from Shanghai to Lisbon, is this integration of the Asian economies, of the Asian economic space, and the likes of which we have, of course, never before seen, because this is the largest single infrastructure investment project in the history of the world, and it will continue throughout our lifetimes, and it will bring together the demographic centers, the economic powerhouses of Asia. This is all of the proposed oil and gas pipelines and railways and electricity grids and hydrological canals. All of these will be built in time. And I think this is going to make Asia that global center of gravity that we believe it will be. I'm going to have to wrap up, so I will just conclude with this. Connectivity being destiny is a better world. We are not destined to immutably live in nation states as the dominant unit of human organization. It is the connective infrastructures that actually shape who we are and our identities, and it makes the world a better place because the more connections we build, the more resilience we have in the system. I'll just give you one example. 10 years ago, if you were to ask defense strategists and experts around the world, where's World War III going to happen? Or how will World War III be fought? People might have said Taiwan, they might have said with Iran or Russia. Certainly people said the United States and China are going to fight a war over Arab oil, over Middle Eastern oil, or African commodities. People said that all the time. In fact, they still do. But let me give you a little news flash. As of April this year, the United States sends oil from Texas through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific Ocean, to the People's Republic of China. Why fight a war with America over oil when you can just buy American oil? And that is a story that began exactly 4 months ago and is going to accelerate like a hockey stick curve in the coming decades. So the more connectivity we have of transportation, of energy, of markets and networks, the more resilience we have. If there is a war in the Straits of Hormuz, if there is a blockage of the Suez Canal, God forbid if there's an incident here in our Strait of Malacca, there are ways around it. Over the Arctic, across Eurasia, and other networks. And the more connectivity we build as a system, the more resilience we have as a civilization. And that's why connectivity is not only destiny, it's what we've always been doing and will continue to do, but it's also going to make the world a much better place. Thank you very much. Thank you.